Anyways, folks, our friend Paris Marx is joining the program right now. Paris, again, the host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast, my go-to official TRRS correspondent for these kinds of issues. We're going to talk about Bill C18 and the ongoing collapse. There it goes, the Dan Ban command. The Dan Ban command. We're going to talk about Bill C18, the ongoing collapse of Canadian media industry, and other kind of tech news. Always happy to talk to Paris, who will be joining the show right now. Hello, Paris. Are you there?
Hello. How's it going?
It's going very well. How are you doing?
I'm well. Happy to join you again, as
Yeah.
always.
Yeah, well, I was explaining, Paris, that you are the official TRRS tech correspondent. Actually, I don't know if you ever agreed to that or anything, but I'm
I'm
officially
honored.
declaring. Yeah. It's good. No, I do really always appreciate getting your perspective on this. Like I was saying, Paris, obviously the host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast. Always really appreciate when you can come on and kind of break down some of these issues for us. And so, like I was saying,
Absolutely.
yeah, like I was saying when I was setting up this segment, um, the whole issue with Canadian media and Bill C18, it's something that I was kind of aware of, but hadn't really dug into all that much. So as the kind of news about this sort of like escalated this week with the bill kind of causing this big backlash from both Google and Meta, who are talking about completely removing news from their product, which is going to have a huge consequence. I thought it'd be a good time to have you come on so you can kind of break down the situation for me and for people in Canada and even people outside of Canada that are curious about how governments around the world are trying to respond to these tech companies and the way that they have this role as media publishers despite not technically being regulated or treated that way. So do you just want to, I guess, start off by breaking down for our viewers here, what is Bill C18 and what caused this big backlash by these tech companies?
Absolutely. I don't blame you for not being like totally up on it. It is a bit of like a boring thing to be following when, there's not big tech companies kind of like threatening to pull all news out of Canada as they finally are now. So now everyone's like paying attention, right? Um, so C18, goes by the other name, the Online News Act. And basically the goal of it, if people are familiar with what happened in Australia a few years ago, where they kind of put together this process to force Google and Facebook to start paying news publishers down there. The Trudeau Liberal government basically looked at that and said, you know what, we like that. We want to do that here. And a lot of the big media companies said, we also want you to do that here because we want money from these big tech companies. And so the government has kind of been working through this process of setting up this kind of, bargaining arrangement between the news publishers and between, Google and Facebook, basically, to make sure that they need to kind of come to the table, come to an agreement so that Google and Facebook have to pay the news publishers for the news content that kind of circulates on their platforms and that they make money off of because, people are engaging with that news. People are seeing advertising on Google and Facebook as they're looking for that news, and they might not even always go to the news publisher's website. And so the idea is to kind of send some of that advertising revenue from Google and Facebook back to the news publishers, which are creating that valuable content, so that the budgets of news companies get a bit more sustainable. And so what is happening right now is that bill finally passed just recently. So, it's becoming law. And now we're kind of moving to the stage where the government is setting up like the actual regulations for how the process is going to play out. And so Google and Facebook are kind of upping the ante in this moment to try to push back and ensure that, the actual regulations are a bit looser than what the actual bill and what the law and what the government has been suggesting, because they don't technically want to like partake in a public process where they're like officially designated by the government as a digital platform that needs to pay the news publishers. They would rather go to them kind of one by one and make deals on their own that are not under kind of the auspices of the government process. and do it that way. But right now, they would be kind of under this legislation. They would be under this kind of government bargaining process, and they don't like that. And so part of the reason that they're kind of upping the ante right now, and that they're kind of holding news publishers and Canadians, basically to ransom to ensure that the government kind of gives in to their requests, is that on the one hand, it's kind of like this make or break moment where, like, what is the end point of this process going to be? And then the other piece of it is they see that there are other jurisdictions watching what is happening in Canada right now. Like California, for example, has said that they plan to move forward with something similar. So the tech companies are basically saying, if you try to come after us, California and other jurisdictions, we are going to do the same thing that we're doing here in Canada. So, like, be careful and make sure that you don't piss us off too much.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting example of this ongoing kind of trend in tech where these big tech companies, like, under the idea that they're going in and like disrupting and creating this new technology, are going into these different industries and totally taking over and dominating them, like you see with Uber and the taxi companies, you see with Airbnb and the hotel industry. And this is an ongoing thing for as long as these big social media companies have been around, basically over the last decade plus, is that they have become news publishers. Or whether they say that they're news publishers or not, they are. But they've completely escaped any scrutiny or accountability, or have avoided being treated like with the very specific rules and laws that are in place to deal with how we treat the news and how it gets out to people. And it just hasn't happened. So it's like, I don't want to give the Liberal Party or the Canadian government too much credit that they're finally getting around to this. And like, I don't know if they're going to back down now that they're trying to like flex the power that they have over people. But I mean, it is interesting now that there's governments around the world, in Canada, and I believe in Australia, this has been going on, in some places in Western Europe as well, that are actually starting to be like, okay, let's start to try and claw back some of the immense power that these tech companies have in delivering news to people. So it's really interesting to see them finally starting to kind of try to do something to deal with this issue.
Yeah, it's very welcome, right? And like, it's about time. It's taken them long enough. It felt like for a long time, the internet was kind of seen as like, we just need to let the internet expand and let these companies expand, and that's like democracy and freedom, and this is how like we open things up in our societies and stuff. And like, maybe that like sort of makes sense to a certain degree in the United States, because you have US companies that are dominating the internet. But when you think of countries outside the United States, basically what you're allowing is these US companies to move in and to dominate everything that happens online, and then to be able to kind of crowd out and outcompete domestic competitors, because they have the advantage of being grounded in the US market and also having this kind of global market that they're serving. So they get the economies of scale that comes with that. But then if you have like domestic players, like if there's like a Canadian rival to Amazon or to Google or whatever, they can't compete the same way if they're just kind of operating within one country. And so, what we've seen for a long time is these US companies kind of move in, kind of dominate the market of internet services and e-commerce and all these other sorts of things. And the expectation is just that we need to be okay with that, because this is the way the internet works, and this is freedom and freedom of speech and blah, blah, blah. And I think that it's about time that government started saying, actually, this is not all right just to allow everything that we do online to be dominated by American companies that also don't want to follow our laws and respect, like, what we expect for our country. And while I don't like totally agree with the way that the Trudeau Liberals have approached this, I think it's good that they're finally, because, when Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015, he was like buddy with Facebook and buddy with Google, and he wanted to be close to the tech companies. And I think it's good that we've reached this point where our political leaders are ready to really kind of start fighting these tech companies and standing up for Canadians. And they should have done it long ago.
Yeah, you really see the kind of like, as much as the whole Silicon Valley tech revolution was pitched as being this democratic and transformative thing, you see how there's this like libertarian sort of ideology that's been animating all the people that run all these companies. And you really see it come out in moments like that. I mean, just getting into like Meta and Facebook and everything, it's like, not only have they acted as a news publisher with completely escaping any scrutiny over the last decade plus, but have been actively harmful to society, both here and around the world. pulling people into this web of conspiracy and misinformation. Like not like in this process of growing to so much, having so much power over distributing news to people, and without any regulation, you see how they've been like completely complicit in like taking a lot, like millions of people, and radicalizing them into these bizarre and fucked up directions that have been hugely consequential, like to our social fabric, which is exactly why these regulations exist in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like if you think about kind of why that happens, I would argue like in part it's because obviously you have these platforms that benefit from like fueling engagement, right? And extreme content gets people more engaged on the platform, gets people more kind of riled up, more likely to engage with content, whether it's to read it and to kind of go down that rabbit hole of radicalization, or to read it and like want to respond to it angrily because this is ridiculous and they're really mad about it, right? So it works really well for these companies. But I would say part of the reason that works as well is that they have also kind of eroded traditional journalism, because all of these companies basically, like if you think about the model of journalism, it was really based on an advertising model, many of these companies, where they made a lot of money from ads that were in their newspapers or on their stations or radio stations or what have you, and that made them a ton of money so that they could fund journalism while still like making profits on the other end. And of course then you had classifieds and other things that brought in revenue as well. But as things have moved online, these major internet companies, and again, American internet companies, Facebook, Google especially, have really eaten up that advertising market. So journalism and media organizations lost a lot of that revenue. They've many publications across Canada, hundreds of publications across Canada over the past decade have closed. You've seen many journalists lose their jobs, and the whole industry as a whole has been struggling as a result. Meanwhile, these companies like Facebook and Google are making massive mega profits by sucking up advertising revenue from all around the world. That's like perilous for all of these journalistic organizations, and so they don't have the resources to actually do local reporting and to do investigative reporting and actually to kind of put in the time to investigate things and report things out, because they just need to get stories out. They need to take things from the Wire, maybe change a few things up and then publish it as their own story. The Wire, like Associated Press and Canadian Press and things like that. And they just don't have the time to do this stuff. Meanwhile, the American right and the billionaires that fund the American right have made a ton of money over the past few decades. And so they funnel that money into right-wing media and right-wing propaganda that then fuels these kind of hate farms on social media, that, radicalize people and blah, blah, blah. Like we see how this all works. It's all a cycle. And these social media platforms contribute to it in many different ways.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting as well. We've had so much talk in Canada lately about like foreign interference into our democracy. Oh no, that with the Chinese, and like the
Yeah.
Chinese are paying off
It's
these
always
like
big,
random,
scary China, right?
yeah, these they're paying off these random liberal backbenchers and sending spy balloons and things like that, interfering in our democracy. And the idea that these American tech companies can just waltz right in and completely overtake and dominate our entire media industry, that's like, oh yeah, that's fine that they do that. Let's not worry about that too much. It's
Totally.
a little bit strange the way we give outsized importance to different countries interfering in our democracy.
It's absolutely hilarious, right? Like only foreign interference by China or Russia or like Iran actually matter, and we should be worried about them. Even though we know that there's plenty of reporting, and CBC just did a story about this the other day about the foreign interference story that comes from India under the Modi regime, and they're increasingly kind of far right Hindu nationalist party, and how they are influencing Canadian elections and trying to influence politics in Canada. Back when the United States was having its big freak out over Russian interference in the elections, like there were plenty of reports that said, okay, like Russia did some stuff, but like actually Israel and Saudi Arabia are like much more involved in trying to
Yeah.
influence American elections, but like we don't talk about those because they don't matter as much, because like they're our allies, quote unquote. So like all this stuff is going on, and like let's be real, like American influence in Canadian elections is also like a very real thing that
Yeah.
very much happens, and they love to kind of make statements to try to sway things in Canadian elections, but we wouldn't talk about it that way because they are a big big friend to the south, right? Yeah, so it just shows like the real hypocrisy that exists there.
Yeah. Yeah, we're basically like a northern province of the United States, but we don't really like to talk about that as well.
Totally. And like if I can just pick up on that too, like if you think about how Canadian politics has like shifted in the past number of decades, like we had Stephen Harper who basically wanted us to be like a mini America. And that was like part of his whole project is he wanted to make us more American because he was a conservative and he believed that like these days he would probably say Canada was like some woke liberal, loser country or something. And he was trying to make it like more manly by following the US or something.
Yeah.
And then you have Justin Trudeau who comes to power. And like when Justin Trudeau comes to power, he says like Canada's back and Canada's back on the world stage and we're going to have this presence again. But really, Justin Trudeau has ensured that Canadian foreign policy is basically in lockstep with the United States. We don't have an independent foreign policy anymore for the most part. And in the cases that we do, it's often just because he's trying to be even more hawkish than the United States is. So we've lost that. And then if we look back to like a few decades ago, like if we look back to the 1970s and even parts of the 1980s before the neoliberal turn, like there was a real desire and a real interest in ensuring that there was like Canadian sovereignty. There was a degree of Canadian nationalism, and like we can talk about whether that's a good thing or not. But like there was explicit desires for cultural protectionism to ensure that we weren't just flooded with American kind of cultural media and all this kind of stuff. That's why we have the CBC, our public broadcaster. It's why we have plenty of public funding for media. It's why we have regulations on the cable companies and the broadcasters and now the streaming companies to ensure that they need to show a certain amount of Canadian content, that they need to fund the creation of Canadian content. But it's also why we have had other programs in the past that have been aimed at trying to ensure that Canada wasn't being kind of taken over by American companies. Our telecom companies can't be owned by foreign companies. They have to be Canadian, and we can hate them because Bell and Rogers and TELUS suck, but at least they're not owned by American companies or some foreign companies, right?
Yeah.
And like there was an interest in ensuring that in the past, and it has very much eroded. And I think that that's a serious problem because we lose the ability to actually have control over what happens in our own country, whether it's Canada or other countries around the world who experience something similar.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like the solution there because we can talk about how Bell and Rogers and TELUS are these Canadian companies. Probably the next step to that is that we need to nationalize all these companies that are operating on public infrastructure in the first place that was funded by federal funding and taxpayer funding, which they've turned into this oligopoly that they immensely profit from. Perhaps we should nationalize all that shit so we can actually own and operate it.
And like we've done that in the past, right? Like TELUS used to be the Alberta public telecom company before it was privatized. And we used to have public telecom companies in Manitoba as well. Saskatchewan still has one, and hopefully they kind of keep it. The right-wing government there is desperate to privatize it and get rid of it. But like, this exists in our history, like nationalizing telecom because these private companies are not serving us properly. And we just like kind of forget that and like memory hole it because like, well, we just couldn't possibly challenge these private companies in the present. The public sector can't be involved in any of this because we have a few decades of neoliberalism. So we just need to let the private market kind of suck us dry and take over everything. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah, no, it is, and it gets into our media as well, and we're talking about the role that Meta and Google and these tech companies play in kind of like disrupting and destroying our media industry. But even if we do manage to successfully like claw back some kind of concessions from them, we still do have this like privatized media industry that's basically owned and operated at this point by one company, predominantly Postmedia, who are now in the process of merging with one of our only remaining like remotely progressive and left-wing newspapers. Like, and we, as you talked about a little bit before, hinted at, we have like Bell Media laying off hundreds of people. Like we're living through this era of like this media consolidation and privatization, and it's really like collapsing in on itself. So as much as it's important to focus on what these tech companies are doing, there's a much broader problem here, which we're not really addressing, which is that our whole media industry is being destroyed. And that's going to have serious consequences for everybody.
Totally. Like, the state of Canadian media, I don't want to like understate it, is really terrible. Especially in the past decade, like we've had so many layoffs, so many closures of newspapers and radio stations and things like that. And then on top of like the merging where we've had Post Media and Nordstar, which owns the Toronto Star, kind of swapping newspapers in the past so they could shut competitors down so that they didn't have to run kind of competing operations. As you say, they're now looking to merge with one another as if that's going to solve any problems in Canadian media. We just saw Bell, as you said, kind of lay off a bunch of journalists, shut down radio stations, consolidate newsrooms, and Bell is one of kind of the major. We talked about them as a telecom company, but they're also one of the major media organizations because they own CTV, which is the largest Canadian cable television station. And they're kind of shutting all that stuff down too. And then on top of that, we've seen BuzzFeed leave, we've seen HuffPost leave, because there was this entrance of like US kind of media startups in the 2010s, and all that stuff is kind of left as well. Of course, we see Vice too, which is in bankruptcy right now. So, just bad across the board. And one thing I would say about that as well is you mentioned Post Media, which owns the National Post and, a bunch of the other kind of major newspapers that are kind of left standing across Canada right now. And that is owned by a US hedge fund, which kind of loaded it up with debt, and now is like cutting it to the bone so that it can pay back that debt and enrich its shareholders. And that was a decision that was explicitly made by the Stephen Harper government, because in the past, a US company would not have been able to buy a Canadian media operation like that. But his government allowed it to happen. And that is part of the reason, but certainly not the only reason, that we're in this state that we're in today. So, like, yes, we need to challenge Meta and Google and what they are doing to Canada and to Canadian media, but we also need to recognize that Canadian media is in a really tough place, and it's not just going to get fixed by giving some more money to Post Media and the Toronto Star and whatnot, but there needs to be a much more kind of fundamental rethink of how Canadian media works and how it's funded to ensure that it serves the public and that it serves, journalists, and so that we can actually have journalists properly employed and doing important local and investigative work and things like that. And not just enriching these shareholders while everything kind of burns down around us.
Yeah. Yeah, all those jobs are now going to be outsourced to Chat GPT.
Yeah.
I mean, like
they would love to.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't doubt it, and I don't doubt that there's going to be a significant effort to do that, which is also something that we're going to have to try and push back on as best we can. I mean, it's interesting because, like, you and I, Paris, I kind of feel like we're part of this whatever movement in this country to try and build alternative media institutions that are outside this framework, like with your podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, and this show and the stuff that I've done, and, all the different shows that are part of the Harbinger Media Network, which we work together on. And that's been a really like satisfying thing to try and build. And I remain incredibly proud of like the work that you and I and others are doing on this. But I got to say, it's been also frustrating how that's been completely ignored by these mainstream journalists who are having their own industry destroyed in front of their very eyes. And they're completely ignoring this big grassroots kind of independent media movement that's trying to be constructed from the ground up by just like random people like you and I. It's been frustrating, and you realize why is because the things that we talk about actually have things to say about challenging who has the power in this country, and are talking about things like nationalization, and are talking about foreign policy and American and Israeli influence in our country and these things. Our mainstream media doesn't want to talk about these things. We don't want to talk about anything that actually legitimately challenges power in this way. So that's what I mean. It's been satisfying to try and work on building these alternative institutions, but it's also been frustrating because I feel like it is really kind of being ignored on a mainstream level, this burgeoning effort to construct these totally new media institutions outside this mainstream framework.
No, totally. And I think it was interesting, I think it was last year, there was the big Rogers outage across Canada where like a bunch of people lost their internet service and 911 service went down and all that kind of stuff. And after like a decade of talking about how we just need more competition in telecommunications, and in internet and in mobile phones and blah blah blah, it seemed like all of a sudden there was like a crack, and like for a brief moment we were able to have some conversations in like the public, the mainstream media, about actually maybe all that we need to do is like nationalize these companies and make telecom a public service. And so like that was fascinating to me, right, to see how it could break in that moment. And I think it's so great to see how there's been so much independent media growing in Canada, kind of, you know, in the ashes of this great kind of fire and destruction that has been happening in the media landscape. You know, whether it's kind of podcasts that do what we do, but also, you know, organizations like The Breach, of course, based in Montreal, that does fantastic kind of, you know, left wing kind of reporting and investigative reporting, or organizations like The Maple, which recently merged up with Passage so that they can kind of combine forces and, you know, wield more kind of effort to do things, or even more like traditional organizations, or maybe not traditional is probably the wrong word, but like, you know, the TIE out in BC, which does progressive reporting as well in British Columbia. So all these things are like happening across the country, and that is fantastic. But I would also say that, you know, it's not enough to kind of fill the void of what has been left with all the hundreds of closures that have happened over the past decade or so. And ultimately, if we do want to try to build a better media in Canada and ensure that journalism is a public good that is kind of doing investigative work, that is providing people with information on their communities and all this kind of stuff, you know, that is not going to be solved by the private market. I think that we need to kind of give up on this fantasy that like if we just have enough people, you know, contributing to Canada Land on Patreon, or like you know, enough people like looking at the ads on media organizations websites or whatever, that we'll all be good and like we'll fix Canadian media. And like that is just not how it's going to work. Like these business models are fundamentally broken, and what we need is for the government to step in and say, okay, we need to like actually look at what is necessary to ensure that journalism can be sustainable and can be done properly in this country. And that means giving CBC, you know, a shitload more money, even though, you know, I have a lot of problems with CBC and they're not great, but they're still essential, and an essential kind of public institution for journalism and for local reporting in particular that should be
Yeah.
expanded. But also thinking about how we set up like a public fund to actually fund journalism that is, you know, nonprofit, that is kind of working really hard, to, you know, kind of let people know about their communities and do these important investigations that we've lost, with all the closures that have happened and all the journalism jobs that have been lost. And that's not going to happen by just kind of linking traditional media organizations to tech companies and ensuring that they can siphon off a bit of the advertising profits. That needs a much deeper kind of rethink and a much bigger kind of public funding mechanism and
Yeah.
program in order to do that.
Yeah. And so just going back to this Bill C18, I mean, do you have any thoughts on who's going to blink first here? Because obviously these tech companies are really trying to, like, again, show their strength and the ability that they have to completely pull back from what has now become like an essential service for a lot of people, like searching Google to find news stories, you know, which is a really common thing, that we all do often. And so, you know, they're going to put the government in a position where they should back down, and it's tough to know, especially when you talk about the relationship traditionally between big tech and the Liberal Party and uh, you know, Trudeau himself and the people around him. Um, so do you have any ideas about what do you think is going to happen about this? Like, do you think like are is this going to be a permanent change? Is the government going to blink, or do we think that if they stay strong, these tech companies are going to end up playing ball, and this is only like a kind of a threatening gesture that they're making?
It's tough to say exactly what is going to happen there. Because in Australia, what happened is, you know, the government was moving forward with something similar to this. And then Facebook pulled Australian news from its platform. And then the government kind of watered it down a bit, to ensure that the tech companies still had to pay the media organizations, but the process was a bit more aligned with how they wanted to do it. And the Canadian government and the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, have been very clear that they do not want to follow that example in Australia, because what happened then is, because the agreements between the tech companies and the media companies were kind of not done through this public government process, but were just signed kind of, you know, one-on-one and whatnot, that they were very secretive, that there was very little information about what actually went into those deals, how much money was changing hands. It was difficult to know any of that information. And so the heritage minister, I watched an interview with him yesterday, and he said that, one of the goals of setting up the process, how they have set it up, is to ensure that there is that transparency that didn't exist in the Australian case. So, they say that they're still talking to Google, whereas talks have been completely cut off with Meta, which is not surprising because I think that Google does kind of depend more on having news content on its platforms and benefits more from that than Facebook does. But it's hard to see either side really backing down at the moment, because the government has really kind of dug their feet into the sand and said that this is the process that we need to have because we need this transparent process and blah, blah, blah. And the tech companies are very clearly saying, this does not work for us. We don't want to go through this government process. We want to ensure that we can kind of sign these deals ourselves, know what money is going to be changing hands. And they've tried to do that in like the couple of years leading up to this process because they knew it was coming anyway. And they recently said that like all the deals they've already made would be canceled if this whole process kind of continues. So yeah, it's tough to see how it's going to go. Like, and honestly, I think if these tech companies do pull their news from their platforms in Canada, so Canadians can't access it, I don't think it would be the end of the world. Like, I think we're really overstating how bad this would be. I think we'd very quickly find other ways of accessing that news and of finding our news. It would just be like a readjustment for a few weeks as we figure that out. And I think right now it's treated as like this doomsday scenario, both for us as news consumers, but also for news organizations. And based on the reading that I've done, like when Facebook pulled the news in Australia, sure, they saw a 13% decline. News organizations saw a 13% decline from traffic from Australia and a 30% decline from traffic from overseas. But that was over a very short period of time because it was very quickly reversed. And there wasn't really time for people to readjust, for news organizations to change the way that they kind of promoted their news and got people to access it. And for regular news consumers to say, okay, I can't get my news through Facebook, so how else am I going to get it? And in Spain, where it was a longer process and where Google took down the news off of its website and off of its search engine, the impact there was that large publishers found that there was very little difference that was made to them because people found other ways of getting the news. Small publishers did experience a bit more of a hit, but large publishers actually kind of benefited because instead of people reading their news articles through news aggregators or through Google, where they're not getting any ad revenue from that, they were going directly to the websites of those news organizations. And so they were generating more revenue for them. So, I think we'll see how it plays out. But either way, I'm not super scared of what's going to happen. But I do think that with the tech companies really pushing back and really digging in their heels and saying, we're going to take all this news off of our platforms and you're just not going to be able to access it because we don't like what the government is doing, I think there's a real opportunity to just say, fuck these platforms, and let's figure out a better way to do this.
Well, that's a pretty good and optimistic way to look at it, I think. And I really appreciate your insight and your analysis of this, Paris.
Absolutely.
And I know as this progresses, you're going to be covering this. So I encourage people to follow Paris on Twitter and follow Tech Won't Save Us to pay attention to this story. It's because it's really important. It has big implications for the way we consume media and the way our media industry is operating in this country. Before we go, is there any other tech stuff we should get to? What about Musk versus Zuckerberg? Do you have a question about that? The fight of the century. So first question, are you going to watch the upcoming brutal grudge match cage fight between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg? Number two, who have you got? Who are you picking as the winner in that?
So first of all, I would say if that actually happened, I would like try to get tickets and go. Like, I would want to see that thing in person. I would want to see Mark Zuckerberg like slam Elon Musk in the face. You know, as much as I hate them both, like I hate Elon more. Let's be honest. So my money would be on Zuck. Zuck has been doing jujitsu for years. He's been trained by a black belt or like a double black belt or something like that. So he has the skills. Now, Elon Musk is heavy. He's a big dude. He's tall. He says his move would be the whale, where he just kind of jumps on his opponent and crushes them.
Well, he's trained in no holds barred street fighting now, as he said the other day. So that's dangerous. dangerous
Of
stuff.
course. Yeah. I remember, as you say that, I remember a story, which is really, I find it funny at least. Elon Musk, when he was a kid, he says that he was bullied a lot, right?
Yeah.
And there was one time that he ended up in the hospital because a kid like pushed him down the stairs. And in his biography, this is kind of explained and talked about as like Elon Musk was bullied
They
really
were so
hard.
mean
This
to
kid pushed
him.
him down the stairs. He ended up in the hospital. But then there's this interview that his father gave where he was like, where he told a completely different rendition of the story, where he was like, yeah, Elon was actually teasing this guy because his dad had committed suicide. And so the kid pushed Elon down the stairs. And his dad was like, initially I was really mad, but then I found out what Elon did, and I was like, nah, the kid was in the right.
Yeah,
Like,
you kind of had it coming.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, my money, I would put my money on Zuck, just because I hate Musk so much. But I'm not even sure it's gonna happen because based on what I was reading, Elon Musk's mommy said he can't
It's
do
not
this, and
allowed.
so it
Yeah.
all got called off. So
Well, I'm hoping that he won't. We got to keep putting the pressure on him. We've seen Elon; he'll
we
respond to
do.
pressure. If people are calling him like, that he's being a wimp or something, if
Yeah,
enough people say it, maybe he's just going to agree with it just to save face.
I hope
Um,
so. I would love to see it.
it's funny you mentioned that thing with his father too, because like again, Elon Musk's father, super weird and
Oh
evil
my
guy
God.
as well.
Yeah.
But I will
The
say,
apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
exactly.
Like
I will say I will give him credit though, because he keeps like dispelling these myths, but that Elon Musk is
yeah.
trying to tell about himself, that he was bullied. The whole thing about, oh, I lived on $1 a day in Canada, and
Yeah.
Elon Musk's father's like, no, you didn't. Like, we gave you lots of money.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is saying like,
It was
everyone
the
talks about
Emerald
this.
Mine money he
Everyone,
was living
everyone
off,
talks
man.
about this emerald mine. What do you? I don't even know what you're talking about. There's no emerald mine, and his own father is just like, no, there was absolutely an emerald mine. Yeah, that was absolutely true. So
Yeah.
I guess respect in these short, small, specific cases to Elon Musk's father for constantly undermining these like bullshit stories that he tries to tell about his upbringing and his youth.
Totally. Like Elon Musk's dad is a total piece of shit. But I think he's more credible on these questions than Elon Musk himself is because he has more incentive to rewrite his history. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Paris, once again, it is fantastic to have you come on the program again. Official TRRS tech correspondent, Paris Marx. He's the host of Tech
Thanks
Won't
so
Save
much.
Us, the author of Road to Nowhere, as well. Um, Always appreciate
You can
talking to you
also
about these issues.
subscribe to my Substack, Disconnect,
Yeah.
where I wrote about the Canadian news bill and everything this morning. If you want to head
Yep.
over and read it,
I already linked that.
fantastic.
Once I'm going to do so again right now in the chat, so people can subscribe to Disconnect and get more hot takes from Paris Marx on this
Awesome,
and
man.
other tech related subjects. Thanks, Paris. I'll talk
Yeah,
to you
man.
again soon.
Always happy to chat with you.
Yeah,
Definitely.
same.
Looking forward to it.
All right, take care.
Bye, everyone.